Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, lovely people, depending on where you are joining us from in this beautiful world. And today I'm really, really looking forward to our conversation. Laura, I've been waiting for this because since our pre-chat, I know that we've got such a beautiful connection and a lot of things where we align with our messages, with our, yeah, view on grief. And I really
Mhm.
can't wait to have this conversation with you. So, would you do us the honor and introduce yourself to our audience, please?
Yes, yeah, and thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to this too. So my name is Laura Walton. I am a licensed therapist and also a coach working with grief and the founder of a business called Grief on Purpose, in which my mission really is to talk about grief, change the conversation around grief and death, and just normalize it as being a thing and a thing that
Yeah,
it's okay to talk about.
yeah. I'm so glad that you're saying this up front. I will definitely hear a little bit more or a lot more about this because these conversations still are so taboo. And I'm really grateful with the podcast, the work I do, the work that you do, that my network, our networks just grow and you meet those people where it is absolutely normal to talk about that. And
Yeah.
I love this because I think we really need it, all of us, whether you have or haven't yet been affected by grief, but it is one topic that concerns really all of us. So maybe let's start with your story, Laura. Are you okay to share a
Mhm.
little bit about what actually got you into the space of grief?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I
Mm,
had in my 20s, I had two really significant and impactful deaths. When I was
mhm,
21, my dad died by suicide. And then when I was 26, he was my boyfriend, but he was also my best friend. We were kind of on and off
mm,
as far as our romantic relationship, but we were best friends.
yeah.
And he died of a drug overdose. And so both of these happened when I was pretty young and at that point, didn't really have a clear career path for myself
Yeah.
lined up. So these experiences were just so impactful
Mm,
and literally life altering for me that they were my motivation to go to grad school, become a therapist,
mm, mm.
start a practice, and start this business and talk about this and do this work.
Yeah. I really love this, what you did with it. Obviously, not what happened, but what you did with this, because for me, this one universal message that I find so, so important in grief is a lot of people sort of fall into this space of, I didn't choose that. I can't change the
Mm.
fact that my husband, my brother, my boyfriend, my loved one died. Yet they often forget that we can choose what we do with it. And I think
Yeah.
that's really where the empowerment lies. And for you at such a young age, I believe you were 21 and 26, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At such a young age to take something that is so significant and so cut through in your experience or in your expectation how life's supposed to unfold and turn it into something so meaningful to help others with that is remarkable at such a young age,
Yeah.
if I may say so. It's really incredible. Um, you and I both lost our dads at a very similar age and to completely different circumstances.
Mm.
Can you share a little bit, as much as you're comfortable with, what that was like for you? Because suicide has got such a massive stigma, and luckily things are starting to change now. But back then, there was such a huge stigma and often even shame attached to that, which I find such a shame, pardon the pun here. Can you share a little bit about that, what it was like for you at such a young age to deal with something like that?
Yeah. His death and the way in which he died was not a surprise to me.
Hmm.
Throughout
Wow.
my younger childhood, I knew that he struggled with mental
Mm,
health. I didn't know I mean, he wasn't ever even officially diagnosed with anything because he didn't believe in
mm,
that. So
mm,
I don't know exactly what, but I knew that he struggled. He talked about suicide when I was a kid. Like he would just kind of
wow.
casually mention it.
Mm,
So that being a topic was normal to me as far as
yeah,
something that I heard about
yeah.
regularly. So when that happened, it wasn't a surprise to me. It was shocking and it was
Yeah.
sad, but it wasn't a surprise. I think a part of me was expecting that that would happen at some
Did
point.
you did you live in constant fear around that growing up? Because hearing that from your dad must be really scary
Mhm.
as a girl.
Yeah, and in hindsight, as I've gotten older and as I've learned more about myself and just learned more
Mm.
about child development and mental health, I believe that that contributed to my becoming like a perfectionist and trying to do everything in life like in whatever way I thought was the right way or the perfect way.
Yeah.
Because I think there was this wasn't, if you had asked me as a child, I could have never articulated this to
Mm.
you, but I
Of
think this
course.
was something, as I was also the oldest child, so I
Hmm.
just connected the dots somewhere in my brain that if I could just figure out the right way to do things, then that would
Mm.
keep everything okay, including keeping
Mm.
my dad alive.
Yeah.
So I think that that's the way um, I just kind of learned to manage that throughout
Mm.
childhood. And that's been something I've had to, figure out how to manage and cope with as an adult
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
um, because not everything's perfect, as we know.
Mm. How many siblings have you got?
I have two siblings.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. And your mom, how did she deal with it when it happened? Because the thing is, I don't want to go into too much detail because it's really up to you how much you want to share or not. But did you find out through your mom, or
Yeah,
how did
I
you? Yeah.
did. My parents had been divorced. So they got divorced when
Hmm.
I was 14 and he died when I was 21.
Hmm.
Um, but I did find out from my mom.
Hmm.
Um, I was not, I was out of town. I was in a different state at the time of his
Hmm.
death. So I found out from a phone call from
Yeah.
her, like early in the morning. He had died the night before. That's how
Hmm.
I found out.
Yeah. So your boyfriend slash best friend at the time, was
Mhm.
he one of your support people after the loss of your dad?
Yeah, we were together at the time of my dad's death,
Mm.
and actually I was out of state because I was visiting him in the state where he
Hmm.
lived. We had a long
Yeah.
distance relationship,
Hmm.
um, so I was with him. But it's interesting looking back because we didn't really talk about it that much,
Mm.
and I think that that's a more broad theme of just how I dealt with my dad's death,
Yeah.
which was by avoiding it. I just didn't talk about it. And that
Yeah.
was at the time the only way that I really knew how to deal with
Mm.
it.
Yeah. And how long, I'm just trying to get the timeline here. How long did it take you after your boyfriend passed away to make the decision to go into psychology?
I so yeah, it's because I didn't really talk about or do anything with my dad's death. I avoided it.
Mm.
When my boyfriend died 5 years later, I mean, my boyfriend and I had a far better relationship than my dad
Hmm.
and I had had. So that was a
Wow.
harder death for me.
Hmm.
But I also think it was compounded by the grief that
Mm.
from my dad's death that I never really
Yeah.
addressed. Um, so my with my boyfriend's death, my world was shattered.
Mm.
It was it was the most devastating thing I've ever experienced and probably will ever experience. So I think I knew pretty soon into the grief, I'll say within the first 6 months after his
Yeah.
death, that I was going to do something with it.
Mm.
I don't think I knew what exactly,
Yeah.
but I could sense that how life altering this was, and that
Hmm.
it almost felt like I didn't have there was no other option other than to do something
Wow.
with this.
That is quite empowering, though, for you to say that so shortly after that, because I'm also grateful that you touched on that topic of compounded grief, because this is something that is so often not talked about or completely
Yeah.
underrated, because not just, but in particular when we don't deal with grief, it then adds to the next time when grief comes up, and I remember that quite vividly when Rob passed away, my husband. And then after my first relationship, I only had one relationship after my husband. And when I broke up with him, there was this compounded grief. It threw everything up that I hadn't yet looked at or I thought I had dealt with, but it came back even more intensely. And ever since I have started working with people experiencing loss, and quite particular widows have shared that same experience with me over and over. You know, when I got into my first relationship, the breakup was almost as hard, sometimes felt even more intense than the loss of my
Yeah.
husband. She said, "How is this even possible?" So I love that you bring this topic up because I think it is a really, really important thing to share here and to really encourage people to go into the healing and really sit with your grief and allow support in. And it doesn't really matter because it so depends on who you are. And I'm talking to all the listeners here. If that is a really close friend that can sit with you and hold space for you, or if you need to go to a psychologist, a coach, a psychiatrist, whatever works for you, but allow support in.
Yeah.
That's what I'm
Yeah.
always saying. Because a compound grief hits you like a ton of bricks. Do you mind sharing a bit about that from your personal experience?
How the compounded grief hit me?
How it affected you? Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to tease them out because I mean, if it was only my boyfriend's death and that was the only thing, that alone would have been absolutely devastating to me.
Yeah.
And it was, but I don't have a clear definition of, what belonged to my dad and what belonged to my boyfriend.
That's the exact thing. I'm glad you say that though, because
Yeah.
it's so important to understand.
Yeah. But I do know that when my boyfriend died, there's no possible way I could have dealt with it the same way I dealt with my dad's death, which was just kind of pretending it didn't happen.
Yeah.
That was impossible with my boyfriend's death.
Yeah.
So yeah, again, I can't really tease out the two, but the way the two situations hit me was completely different.
Yeah, I think you already answered that question perfectly because I think that's a really valid point. It's not even about separating anymore, like whose was which. Like it's just impossible. But it really is that compound effect that hits you like such a wave. And we usually then go into psychology. Like I think I'd like to hear your version of this because I feel like when you go into an avenue that is anything related to self-development, there's always, always, always this element of, working on yourself, having to heal your own triggers, looking at your triggers, sitting with them, healing them. Because when you then start working with people, there's no way that you could hold space for them and be there for them, help them heal if you haven't dealt with your own. And sometimes it happens that when you sit with a client, that something comes up, we're like, oh, note to self, I need to delve back into that. Can you share a little bit
come
about
back to that.
your journey? Yeah. Can you share a bit about how you what was it like doing the training? Did you work for somebody else? Did you start your own business? What was your journey like?
Yeah, well, I went to grad school, and then in the last year of that program, we started our internship. And so that was my first, real experience sitting as a therapist. And that was in an agency setting. I was working primarily with families who were involved with child protective services. So there had been something that happened and they had been mandated to have therapy. So we went into their homes and did the therapy there. And then I did that internship for a year doing that. And then my first paid job after that was at a different agency, but the same kind of work, working with those same families within their homes. And I did that I worked at that agency and I did that work in combination with some work in the prisons and the jails because they had that same agency had a different state contract. And I really actually loved that work more, working in the prisons and the jails. But because of what my license is. I wasn't getting the hours I needed to get my license, so I couldn't do that as
Yeah.
much. But anyway, then once I got the X amount of hours that you have to get here to get your license, your independent license, then I was able to open my own practice. And so I stopped working in the agency and started my own business, my own practice. And when I had more freedom in that, then I could be more specific about which sort of populations I wanted to work with. And I focused more on grief and trauma because through all of this, as you were saying, you kind of learn about yourself. And through all
Yeah.
of my education and experience, I learned a whole lot about trauma, and just became really fascinated with that too. And grief and trauma very often go hand in hand. But that road of trauma became another really interesting one to me.
Yeah. So to me, it's just really fascinating when you think about the road that you literally paved to walk there and then be able to help other people and continuously do your own work. I feel there's always something coming up. For me, this is all part of life. You know, we learn and we grow and we heal and then we teach others. And it's just so beautiful when you look at that, because a lot of people um, succumb to that belief of society that you can't ever heal grief. I personally don't believe in that because I have learned to look at grief very differently. I don't see grief as a permanent resident in my house. I see grief like a visitor. Every now and then she comes and I sit with her and we cry and sometimes we laugh, but I bid her farewell and joy lives with me permanently. I don't always see her, but she lives here, you know?
Yeah.
So that's a sort of picture that I have. What's your take on that? Is grief
Yeah.
permanent? Is it not? Will it stay with you forever? What is your reframe, I should say?
Yeah, I love
Mm,
yours. And this is
mm,
really an interesting question to me because it's something I've really been like sitting with recently. It's been coming
mm,
up in different ways for me
yeah.
recently. And like what grief even is, how do we define it? Um,
Mm,
because I had an interesting experience with this in December.
mm-hmm,
December was the month of my boyfriend's birthday. And
mm-hmm,
so this past December, I had, for the first time, this experience with grief that was very different than anything I've experienced with grief before, and very different than, when you say the word grief,
yeah.
what most of us probably think of.
Yeah.
Uh, I was listening to a song that reminded me of him, and I just felt this overwhelming sense of joy and awe and gratitude that I
I'm
could
having
have.
goosebumps.
Yeah, because quick side note, I've felt a connection with him since he
Mm,
died. And
mm,
that's showed up in various ways, but so that joy and awe was that I could have this experience of having this continued connection with him in a
love it.
different form. But just
Mm-hmm,
that was even possible was like blowing my mind as I was
mm-hmm,
listening to this song. And that sparked this thought of like, well, what if this is also grief, but
mm,
it just looks different than how we've always been taught grief looks, or the way
yeah.
that we always think about grief. But this is also, a response to the loss of him that I experienced.
Yeah.
Um, so I've been sitting with that, and I don't feel like I have a definitive answer, and maybe I don't need
Mm-hmm,
one, or maybe I never will. But
yeah.
that's become for me a definition of grief as well, a way
Mm-hmm,
that I experience my grief.
yeah. It's all, yeah, for me, there are so many emotions that coexist. And what always
Yeah.
puzzles me is before you talk about or experience a loss, people find it absolutely normal that our life exists of sadness and happiness and all hundreds of other emotions and nuances in
Yeah.
between. It's completely normal. But once we experience a significant loss, all of a sudden, society sort of dictates, and I use these words deliberately now, that, okay, now your life is over, or the constant happiness or is over, and grief will stay with you forever, and all these beliefs, let's call them. And I don't want to accept them as my norm because I feel like, yeah, there's grief, And yes, there's joy, and yes, there's a connection. I too had some really incredibly deep spiritual epiphanies and experiences of connection where I was completely
Hmm.
wowed. And I feel all of that has become my inner guidance, has become my protection shield, my
Yeah.
everything. It is really beautiful to now feel it as such. Do I find it beautiful that my husband passed away? Absolutely not. Do I find it beautiful what I did with it, what he did with it, what the
Yeah.
connection has become? Absolutely. It is a gift that you cannot explain with
Yeah.
words. And often when people are in this sort of, I don't know if I want to call it disbelief, or it's just this not understanding. In my
Hmm.
mind, I don't often say it out loud, but in my mind, I always think like, I'm glad you don't understand, because it means you
Yeah.
haven't experienced that, and I'm
Right.
very happy for you that you don't understand that yet. So there's so much judgment in the space of grief, or how it's supposed to be, and expectations, in particular from people who haven't actually experienced it.
Yeah. Yes.
So yeah.
Yeah.
So I really like that, because I think, all emotions are so valid and are there all
Hmm.
the time, every day. But as soon as loss comes in, people feel like, okay, this is it now. And it's not. It doesn't have to be like that. I love that
Yeah.
you shared this deep joy experience that you felt. It's amazing.
Yeah. It was really impactful to me.
Mm,
And I don't think that ever would have happened. I could have ever even gotten to a place like that if I had never allowed myself to,
mm.
sit in the grief and feel
Yeah,
the discomfort and be
mm,
in it for a long time. Like that's a part of it for sure.
yeah, yeah. Um, how is the best way that people connect with you if they want to hear, read about you, connect with you, maybe even work with you? What is the best way how
Mhm.
they can learn more about you and connect with you?
Yeah, best ways are probably either through my website, which is griefonpurpose.com,
Mm-hmm,
or Instagram or social media, which is grief.on.purpose.
mm-hmm. We will definitely be sharing the links as well, because I just find it so much easier that people can just reach out
Yeah.
that way. So once we finish this video, I'll go back and add the show notes. YouTube is kindly not allowing me to do that beforehand. But what is, if there is, I'm just going to put you on the spot here.
Mm.
What was the highlight of your grief journey? I understand that's a very bizarre question, but when you look back, what do you feel was the most important and most beautiful thing for you to discover or learn about yourself?
I like that question.
Mm,
I think it was through my yoga practice. So my yoga
mhm,
practice, I could talk about this for days, but my yoga practice was became my primary anchor throughout my
mm,
grief. And it wasn't just about my physical practice of yoga, it was the whole
mhm,
study of yoga. But the main lesson, let's say, that I got from that, which was transformative in my grief, but also is very helpful in life, um, was just this practice of learning how to relax with what is, with the
mm,
reality. Even
mm,
if I hate the reality, even if I hate what is, even if I would pay millions of dollars to change what is
mhm.
what is.
Yeah.
And learning how to relax with that
Mm,
was a life-changing practice for me.
yeah. So how old were you when you started with yoga?
I started, I think, soon after my dad's death. I started when I was
Mm,
21.
mm,
And then I just, I practiced physically pretty much every day after that. I just
mhm,
fell in love with it. But then I deepened my studies. I've done multiple teacher trainings and
mhm.
just studying
Just wanted to
the
ask you
more.
if you teach it now.
Yeah. I don't
Mhm,
really teach it as far as I don't teach group classes, but I integrate the
mhm,
philosophy of yoga into
mhm.
the work that I do.
Beautiful. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's amazing. I I'm really thinking, because the whole, like, I'm very much into somatic yoga because I just love it in conjunction with grief, and I'm absolutely certain you know everything about it and way more than I do. Um, so I'm wondering if, when you said you sort of ignored your dad's passing for quite some time until it came back compounded. How much the yoga practice actually did already help you without realizing in hindsight,
I think that's really a really good awareness and a great point that I maybe never would have thought about myself. So thank you for bringing that. But I do think it did, because I started it soon after his death, not linking the two at all, but throughout my whole life, I think I had been totally separate from my body. Like my mind and my body were two separate things. And one of the things that I really got from yoga initially was just a connection back into my body. And that was knowing what I know now. I know that that's hugely important for grief. And so, I think without me knowing it, without us ever even needing to put a name on it, that physical practice of yoga, I think, was probably helpful with me with the grief from my dad's death.
So beautiful. I love that.
Yeah.
I love when you walk your path and then every now and then you turn around and all of a sudden you see all these alignments happening on your timeline where you're like, oh, that's why I did that.
That makes
Even
sense.
before the loss, we're like, oh, that's why I became, that's why, like all these epiphanies about yourself and who you are and what you've done and the choices that we have made, when they all start making sense, because often in interviews, I get this, nothing prepares you for death. And I'm now at the point where I'm like, or does it?
Yeah. Yeah.
It is very, very bizarre when you look back and have these, like even looking back, the things that happened before Rob died and the career changes I made that then actually really prepared me for dealing with something so significant and so deep and huge. And I love looking back now and seeing where you had these moments. And with that being said, if you want our listeners to have, if there's even just one takeaway from our conversation, what would you like our listeners to take away from that you would like to highlight? Where, like, if you are dealing with grief right now, I just want to wrap this up for you to think about or to sit with. Is there anything that you would like to share?
Yeah, I'm just going to go with the first thing that's coming to mind. But what that is softening around the edges. So this ties into the relaxing with what is. But this practice or this curiosity, maybe even of how can we soften around the edges of fill in the blank, whatever it is. As it relates to grief or death, though, how can we soften around the edges of our grief? There's obviously no right or wrong answer there, but I think it's that consideration. Yeah, that consideration can really open up a lot of possibility.
Wow. I absolutely admire your path, what you have chosen to do with this and how you have chosen to help other people with this is really beautiful, Laura. So I can't thank you enough for being here today. And everyone listening to this who's like, you know what? I know someone who needs to hear this. Please do share this podcast episode, because I always feel when you're listening to this and there is a particular person or multiple people pop up that you think of, then it's exactly those who need to hear this podcast. So please feel free to share. And of course, if you like what you heard here, subscribe to our weekly episodes of Unsilence Grief. With that being said, thank you so much for being here, Laura. I really enjoyed our conversation. This is Laura and Marie signing off. Thank you. I need this to find my buttons. Bye for now.